September 17th, 1944. 8 miles west of Arnhem, Netherlands. The sky fills with gliders, not dropping scattered men by parachute who'd land miles apart, scrambling to regroup, but delivering entire fighting units, landing in formed platoons with weapons, jeeps, and anti-tank guns. 28 fully armed soldiers stepping off each glider, ready to fight. The man who made this possible wasn't a general, wasn't an engineer. He was a pilot the RAF had rejected 9 years earlier. They'd called him unfit to fly, said he'd never lead men into battle from the air. They were catastrophically wrong. This is the story of how George Chatterton, a washed-up fighter pilot with no business being anywhere near an aircraft, forged the most lethal flying infantry force in British military history. The story of how a man banned from flying created soldiers who were deadlier in the air than on the ground. Stay until the end, because what happened at Arnhem would prove whether his radical vision was genius or madness. May 10th, 1940. Fort Eben-Emael, Belgium. Winston Churchill sat in his first day as Prime Minister, reading intelligence reports that should have been impossible. The fortress was impregnable. 16 miles of interconnected tunnels, steel cupolas housing 75mm guns, 1,000 Belgian soldiers. It guarded the bridges into Belgium, the gateway to France. The Germans took it in 18 hours, not with a massive ground assault, not with artillery bombardment, not with overwhelming force, with 78 men in 11 gliders. They'd landed on the roof before dawn. Silent, deadly, used shaped charges to blow the gun positions from above. By the time the Belgians understood what was happening, the Germans controlled the fortress. Churchill was stunned. The British had nothing like this. The French had nothing like this. The entire defensive strategy of Western Europe had been built on the assumption that you needed thousands of men and weeks of bombardment to take a fortress. The Germans had rewritten warfare with silent aircraft that cost a few £100 and needed no fuel. Churchill fired off a memo demanding 5,000 parachute troops. The Air Ministry pushed back. Not enough aircraft, not enough training capacity, not enough time. They compromised on 500. But Churchill saw something else, something the Air Ministry missed. The problem wasn't just about dropping men from the sky. Parachutists scattered over miles. They'd spend hours regrouping, vulnerable, searching for their weapons containers that had drifted away. You drop a battalion and get scattered squads hitting different objectives at different times. Gliders were different. A glider put an entire unit on the ground together, in formation, with all their equipment, a jeep and anti-tank gun, a mortar team complete and ready to fire, an engineer section with all their demolition charges. But there was one catastrophic problem with gliders. Who would fly them? The RAF insisted gliders were aircraft, therefore RAF pilots must fly them. But RAF pilots were needed to fly the bombers towing the gliders. And once they landed, RAF pilots weren't trained infantry. They couldn't fight. The Army insisted glider pilots should come from their ranks so they could fight after landing. But soldiers couldn't fly. The compromise was bureaucratic madness. The Army would recruit the men. The RAF would train them to fly. They'd belong to neither service completely. Everyone predicted disaster. It was into this organizational nightmare that a broken pilot volunteered in 1941. George Chatterton was not supposed to be anywhere near an aircraft. Born in 1912, he'd dreamed of flying since childhood. Joined the RAF in 1930, posted to No. 1 Squadron at Tangmere. Within a few years, he'd become one of their best aerobatic pilots, flying displays across Britain and Europe. The kind of pilot who made flying look like art. Then came 1935. The crash, the medical board, the verdict, unfit to fly. At 23, his dream was over. The RAF discharged him. Whatever happened in that crash, whatever injuries he sustained, the doctors were clear. George Chatterton would never be an RAF pilot again. He tried civilian life, but with war coming, he couldn't stay away. In 1938, he joined the Army, the Queen's Royal Regiment. If he couldn't fly, he'd fight. He went to France with the British Expeditionary Force in 1939, evacuated from Dunkirk in 1940, spent months in tedious home defense duties, watching the war happen without him. Then he heard about a new unit, something experimental. The Glider Pilot Regiment. They needed men who could fly, but they also needed soldiers. It was the perfect collision of everything he'd been. RAF pilot, Army officer, a man who understood both worlds. He volunteered in 1941. The regiment's first commander, Lieutenant Colonel John Rock, was building something unprecedented. Soldiers who flew, pilots who fought. Rock worked tirelessly through 1942, laying foundations, establishing training protocols, convincing skeptical generals that the concept could work. Then, October 8, 1942, Rock's aircraft went down during a night training flight. He didn't survive. The regiment was leaderless, undertrained, undermanned, about to be committed to combat operations they weren't ready for. Someone needed to take command. Someone who understood both flying and infantry tactics. Someone ruthless enough to do whatever it took to prepare these men for what was coming. George Chatterton got the job. He was 30 years old, a former fighter pilot who'd been medically barred from flying, now commanding men who would fly unarmed aircraft into enemy fire. His first speech to the regiment set the tone. We will forge this regiment as a weapon of attack. Not only will we be trained as pilots, but in all we do. I shall be quite ruthless. Only the best will be tolerated. If you do not like it, you can go back whence you came. He didn't mean it as motivation. He meant it as a warning. Chatterton understood something the bureaucrats didn't. The concept of a glider pilot was insane. You flew a canvas and wood aircraft with no engine into enemy territory. You had one shot at landing, no go around, no second chance. Hit the landing zone or crash trying. Then, the moment you touched down, you had to switch from pilot to infantry soldier. Fight your way off the landing zone. Defend positions. Attack objectives. Most men couldn't do one of those things well. Chatterton needed men who could do both perfectly. He brought in drill sergeants from the Brigade of Guards, the most feared military trainers in the British Army, men who'd made Guards officers weep. The training was brutal. 6 weeks of military conditioning before flying training even started. Weapons drills, hand-to-hand combat, map reading, radio operation, medical training. Chatterton's vision was absolute. Glider pilots would be trained on every weapons system their passengers used, every piece of equipment. They had to be able to take command in any situation. If a commander was killed, a glider pilot could step in. They'd train with the RAF on Tiger Moths and Magisters first, learn basic flying, then transition to gliders, the Hotspur for training, then the Horsa, the workhorse that could carry 28 men, a jeep and trailer, or a 75mm artillery piece. But Chatterton added something the RAF training didn't include: Combat scenarios, night landings, landing in confined spaces, landing under fire. The RAF thought he was mad. Gliders were delicate enough in perfect conditions. Chatterton understood that perfect conditions didn't exist in war. He obsessed over every detail, studied German glider operations, read every after-action report, identified what worked and what got men killed. The problem crystallized in his mind during those months of 1943. The enemy doesn't fear soldiers coming by glider. They fear soldiers who land ready to fight. Formation intact, equipment ready. No delay. That was the revolution. Not the aircraft, the concept. He called them total soldiers. Men who could fly any glider, fire any weapon, treat any casualty, lead any unit. By May 1943, when the regiment got orders for their first operation, Chatterton had forged something unique in military history. Not pilots who could fight, not soldiers who could fly, warriors who could do both. Now they had to prove it. May 1943. North Africa, Operation Ladbrokes. Major General Hopkinson showed Chatterton the plan for the Sicily invasion. The 1st Air Landing Brigade would fly 250 miles across the Mediterranean. At night, land on sloping zones strewn with rocks, bordered by stone walls and ditches. Chatterton listened, his stomach sinking with each detail. "Sir, with respect, there are no gliders in North Africa. We'll get American Wacos. My men haven't trained on Wacos, and American crews will tow us? The 51st Troop Carrier Wing. Excellent pilots. For night operations over the Mediterranean, sir, my pilots have virtually no night flying experience." Hopkinson's face hardened. "Colonel Chatterton, are you refusing this operation?" The question hung in the air. Chatterton knew the real choice. Say yes and lead his men into what looked like a massacre. Say no and be removed, replaced by someone with less experience who'd lead them into the same massacre anyway. "No, sir, we'll do it." Hopkinson left him alone in the room. Chatterton stared at the maps. 250 miles over water. Night release, unknown landing zones. This was going to be catastrophic. He radioed Britain, requested a team of American glider instructors. They arrived within days. His men learned the Waco glider in compressed training sessions. The Waco was smaller than the Horsa. Different handling characteristics, different landing speed. Then Chatterton proposed something audacious. Operation Beggar. Fly British Horsa gliders 1,400 miles from Britain to North Africa. Over the Mediterranean, within range of German fighters. The War Office said it was impossible. Glider tows didn't work over that distance. Chatterton insisted. He got approval. 27 Horsas made the journey. It was the longest glider tow operation ever attempted. Every single glider arrived safely. But only 8 could be allocated to his operation. The rest went to other missions. Chatterton flew reconnaissance over Sicily in a Beaufighter, skimmed low over the landing zones, saw the rocky terrain, the walls, the obstacles. He came back knowing men were going to die. The hardest decision: release altitude. Fly too low, approaching Sicily, and Italian radar wouldn't detect them. But release too low, and gliders would ditch in the sea before reaching shore. Release too high, and they'd be easy targets for anti-aircraft fire. He calculated, recalculated, changed his mind daily as weather forecasts came in. July 9th, 1943. D-Day for Sicily. Wing Commander Peter May approached Chatterton before takeoff. looked at his suede chukka boots. "You know, George, I've always admired those boots. Shame if they went to waste." Chatterton forced a smile. "Ask my Batman for them if I don't come back." The tow aircraft climbed, formation after formation. The Mediterranean stretched below, dark and endless. Chatterton rode in chalk number 2. Brigadier Hicks and his headquarters staff behind him. The release point came. He pulled the lever. The tow rope fell away. Silence. Chatterton couldn't see the coastline. Just darkness and the sound of wind over canvas wings. 200 feet above the water. Then, shapes emerging. A cliff face, coming fast. Too fast. He pulled back on the stick. The glider's nose lifted, protesting. A wing clipped something. Tracer fire stitched across the darkness. Impact. The glider hit the Mediterranean 100 yards from shore. Water flooded the cabin in seconds. Chatterton got out. Everyone got out. They swam for shore in full combat gear. Made it. Linked up with an SAS patrol. By dawn, they'd attacked and silenced several Italian positions. Captured 150 prisoners. But the operation was a disaster. Of the 147 gliders launched, 69 crashed into the sea. Over 300 men drowned. Navigational errors. High winds. The inexperience Chatterton had warned about. Yet something remarkable happened. The gliders that made it to Sicily performed brilliantly. Units landed together, fought together. Within hours, the bridge objectives were secured. The concept worked. The execution had been flawed, but the concept worked. Chatterton was awarded the Distinguished Service Order. The citation praised his leadership, his training program, his personal courage. But Chatterton didn't celebrate. He studied every failure, every crashed glider, every drowned pilot. Never again. June 6, 1944, Normandy, D-Day. Chatterton had spent months working with 1st British Airborne Corps headquarters, planning, refining, fixing every mistake from Sicily, better coordination with tug crews, better training for night operations, better intelligence on landing zones, better release procedures. The glider landings in Normandy were spectacularly successful. Major John Howard's coup de main force, 6 gliders, landed within 47 yards of Pegasus Bridge. The first glider touched down at exactly 12:16 a.m. By 12:26, the bridge was captured. German garrison overwhelmed before they understood what had hit them. The operation became legendary. Churchill called it one of the most daring actions of the war. But Chatterton saw it differently. This was what glider operations should have been in Sicily. Precision, timing, units landing ready to fight, the total soldier concept vindicated. His pilots landed, then fought as infantry, held the bridges until relieved by seaborne forces. The strategic impact was immense. The bridges allowed Allied armor to bypass German defenses. The 6th Airborne Division held the eastern flank of the invasion. German counterattacks broke against prepared positions. Military historians would later estimate that securing those bridges saved weeks of fighting, potentially thousands of casualties. But the hardest test was still coming. September 1944, Operation Market Garden, the largest airborne operation in history. The plan: capture bridges across the Netherlands, create a corridor for the British Second Army to drive into Germany, end the war by Christmas. Chatterton's Glider Pilot Regiment would deliver 1,262 men to Arnhem, the farthest objective, the most important bridge. Chatterton flew Lieutenant General Browning to Nijmegen. His headquarters and part of A Squadron supported the American 82nd Airborne. At Arnhem, the landing zones were 8 miles from the bridge. Chatterton had argued for a coup de main landing directly at the bridge, like Normandy. 5 or 6 gliders. Seize it immediately. I distinctly remembered being called a bloody murderer and assassin for suggesting it. The RAF refused. Too close to deal in airfield. The anti-aircraft guns would shred the gliders and tow aircraft. Except intelligence was wrong. The guns weren't there. The gliders landed perfectly on the zones 8 miles away. But the 8-mile advance took too long. German SS Panzer divisions were in the area. British troops reached the bridge but couldn't be reinforced quickly enough. The battle at Arnhem became a bloodbath. Of Chatterton's 1,262 glider pilots at Arnhem, 219 were killed, 511 captured. The Glider Pilot Regiment suffered a 17.3% fatality rate, the highest of any unit in the battle, but they fought. God, did they fight. They weren't just pilots anymore. They were infantry. They held positions. They conducted counterattacks. They evacuated wounded under fire. Witnesses reported seeing glider pilots manning positions, yelling abuse at German loudspeakers demanding surrender. When asked to quit, they swore and kept fighting. The regiment was decimated, nearly destroyed. In the aftermath, Chatterton had to rebuild. He borrowed RAF pilots to fill the gaps, hundreds of them, trained them in his methods, the total soldier approach. March 1945, Operation Varsity, crossing the Rhine, this time in daylight, this time against prepared defenses bristling with anti-aircraft guns. The slow gliders, vulnerable and unarmored, flew into a storm of flak. The casualties were catastrophic. But the operation succeeded. The Rhine was crossed. Germany's last natural barrier breached. 60% of the glider pilot regiments killed in action that day were RAF pilots. Men who'd joined Chatterton's vision, men who'd learned to be total soldiers. They'd proved it worked, under the worst conditions imaginable. By war's end, the numbers told the story. The Glider Pilot Regiment delivered over 10,000 troops into combat across multiple operations. They captured critical bridges. They held defensive positions. They enabled armored advances. They changed how armies thought about vertical envelopment. But more importantly, they changed how armies thought about soldiers. Chatterton's concept, the soldier who could master multiple disciplines, who could switch roles instantly, became the foundation for special forces training worldwide. The SAS, the SEALS, Delta Force. Every modern special operations unit trains cross-functional warriors, soldiers who can fly, fight, navigate, communicate, lead. Total soldiers. The glider itself became obsolete. Helicopters replaced them after the war. But the concept? The vision of soldiers mastering air and ground operations? That never died. 1975. An interviewer asked Brigadier George Chatterton about his achievements, about commanding the Glider Pilot Regiment. I wasn't special. I was just a fellow who couldn't fly RAF aircraft anymore and had to find another way. The interviewer pressed. Surely he took pride in creating the total soldier concept. Chatterton paused, lit his pipe. The real lesson wasn't about gliders or training. It was about listening to unconventional ideas. I was a failed pilot building a regiment of soldier pilots. That shouldn't have worked. But someone gave it a chance. He never sought glory. After the war, he worked in finance. helped establish charitable trusts, raised over £1 million for the Thalidomide Trust. When the Glider Pilot Regimental Association held reunions, Chatterton attended quietly, listened to his men tell stories, rarely added his own. He was appointed Officer of the Order of the British Empire for his charitable work, not his military service. November 1987. George Chatterton died at age 75. The obituaries mentioned his wartime service briefly, most focused on his post-war humanitarian efforts. No one called him a revolutionary. No one emphasized that he'd been rejected by the RAF, then created something the RAF couldn't. But at the Museum of Army Flying at Middle Wallop, a restored Horsa glider sits in the main hall. A plaque nearby explains the Glider Pilot Regiment, the casualties they suffered, the battles they won. And on that plaque, a quote from one of the German generals captured after Arnhem. "Your glider pilots fought like devils. We thought they would surrender after landing. Instead, they fought harder than your paratroopers. We had no defense against soldiers who fought from the moment they landed." The ultimate tribute from an enemy who'd watched in horror as canvas gliders delivered men who refused to quit. Hitler's biggest secret weapon wasn't the V-2 rocket, wasn't the Tiger tank, wasn't the jet fighter. It was the concept that soldiers could be more than soldiers. That specialization was a trap, that the most effective warriors were those who could master every role. And one rejected pilot, barred from flying, exposed that truth by creating an army that flew into hell and fought its way out. Not because they were superhuman, but because someone refused to accept that unfit to fly meant unfit to lead.